Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's a-gonna trouble the water. See that band all dressed in white. God's a-gonna trouble the water. The leader looks like the Israelite. God's a-gonna trouble the water. Ooh, wade in the water. Oh, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God is gonna trouble. God's a-gonna trouble the water. Oh, see that band all dressed in red. God's a-gonna trouble the water. Ooh, it looks like the band that Moses led. God's a-gonna trouble the water. Oh, whoa, whoa, wade in the water. Oh, wade in the water, children. Trouble, yes, he will. The water. Oh, 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 ooh, oh, oh. God is gonna trouble. God's gonna trouble the water. There's healing in the water, yeah, 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 yeah. The water. Deliverance in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. My God is gonna trouble, gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's a-gonna trouble the water. See that band all dressed in white. God's a-gonna trouble the water. The leader looks like the Israelite. God's a-gonna trouble the water. Ooh, wade in the water. Oh, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God is gonna trouble. God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, see that band all dressed in red. God's gonna trouble the water. Ooh, it looks like the band that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Oh, whoa, whoa, wade in the water. Oh, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God is gonna trouble, yes, he will. The water. Oh, 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 oh. Ooh, oh, oh. Ooh, God is gonna trouble. God's gonna trouble the water. There's healing in the water, yeah, 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 yeah. The water. Deliverance in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. My God is gonna trouble, gonna trouble the water.
Right hand so happy that you're here. This is a very, very special evening. And I think the opening sequence kind of spoke everything that I needed to speak. So I'm just going to, at this point, invite our guest, Professor Gerard Aching. And rather than trying to introduce him, I would invite him to introduce himself and tell you what about him he would like you to know. Gerard.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. And I'd like to begin, in fact, by giving a shout out to Reverend Terence King, who is here. And he's actually the pastor of the church, the St. James AME Zion Church, about which I'll be speaking a little bit about in the latter part of the presentation today. So I'm a professor in the Africana studies as well as in Romance studies at Cornell. And I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago. And a lot of my work has been on the Caribbean 19th century, particularly looking at colonialism and slavery. My last project was on Cuba, in fact, in the 19th century, on the only slave narrative that exists in the Spanish-speaking world there. And so here I am, very far away, landlocked in upstate New York, nothing to do with the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, there was no underground railroad for obvious reasons. But here I was, and have been. I also studied at Cornell. And so I came back up here, and then an unusual thing happened, just like so many unusual things during the 2020 and COVID. I was already working on the Underground Railroad in conjunction with the St. James AME Zion Church. And so what we would do would be, we would take students to the site, and several sites in central New York. And I was always amazed by their reactions afterward, you know, because you can give them all the reading, you can have them look at the history books and so on, but just to see their reactions when they were on the site, and just to see the wheels turning, you know, in terms of imagining what that history was like, imagining what that experience would have been like. And so the inspiration came from there, especially during 2020, when I had community partners, but also especially collaborators who I didn't expect to come on board from Cornell. I was approached by colleagues from the archaeology department who couldn't travel normally, I mean, during that period, and wanted to work with us on the Underground Railroad project. I was also approached by the Milstein Program for Technology and Humanity, wanting to do the same thing in 2020. So there I was. Initially, the reason, and I think Sushmita also had this question in mind, is why am I doing this work? What sort of led me to this work, if I'm anticipating a question. And I think whereas I could have done the research on reflecting on questions of freedom that I've done in the past, to be thinking about that, being able to visit the sites and then be confronted with the fact that we will never have all the information we need, simply because the Underground Railroad was clandestine. And so it means that we also have to do some work of imagining what that would have been like. And so that's the path that we're on, that is to say, the collaborators, students, and so on. And fundamentally, what I'm after, and when you begin a research project, you think, for example, the obvious thing for me to do would have been to compare questions of freedom that I had studied in the Caribbean in the 19th century with, again, the similar period in the United States, 19th century. But then, you know, just because it's an underground railroad, and the typical idea that we have about the Underground Railroad is somebody travels through it, and at the end of that trip, then they are free. To a certain degree, they are free, but then they are in this kind of no man's land, no woman's land of they're not citizens. What is their status? And I've asked my colleagues in law school, what would you say about this person who comes out on the other side of the Underground Railroad? And so the direction that I'm going, and that's part of the title that you have, is to be thinking about the Underground Railroad as a rebirth, a social rebirth. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But first, let me give you a sense of what we're doing currently and get back to that historical question afterwards. So I'll just share the screen for a minute, and you'll be able to see something of the excavation and what we're doing right now.
Historically, this church has been a stop on the Underground Railroad, and it has also been the community meeting spot of activists and abolitionists throughout the history of that season and that time.
What archaeology does is it slowly peels back the layers of time. So we start where we are today, and we go back slowly through the 20th century into the 19th century. And so it's no longer just telling the story of the Underground Railroad, but it really became more broadly encompassing about how we tell the story of this congregation and this church over the course of 150, 170 years here in Ithaca, and the role that the institution has played in making this town and this community.
What archaeology offers to the study of this period is a really up-close look at the practices of everyday life. And so, you can see here some of the artifacts we found so far include ceramics, some glass, iron nails. All of these artifacts are important because in one way or another, they can help us tell stories of everyday life at the church.
One of the things that's been inspiring about the project is the first time I took students to the site, they came out so full of curiosity and wonder, and it sort of sparked a kind of historical imagination.
There's something about kinesthetically being involved in certain things, moving and digging, and I think this excavation adds that other mode of learning. For St. James and Cornell to build that connection, that collaboration, here you now have the work beyond the pages of the book.
It's about there, you can see all the tree rings?
Yeah.
So it's not just that we're revealing the history of this community. I've actually met people that I never would have met if we didn't start this project. People come down the sidewalks and check in with us each week and see what else we found, and they've now become new associates and new friends.
When somebody finds something, we're all very supportive about it and sharing that. We're trying to give each other that joy of finding something big.
I think that this is what's so particularly entrancing about archaeological research is that it doesn't just explore a community, it builds one at the same time.
Scott, there we go. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, SJ05.
So that would give you a sense of the people who are the fact finders for us, the archaeologists. And on the other side of that is the Voices on the Underground Railroad, which is a website that was built in conjunction with students from the Milstein program in technology and humanity. Now, both of these, the excavation and the website, are under the umbrella of what we're calling the Underground Railroad Research Project. And to give you a sense of this website, which will be going public at the end of the month, what we've done is we've mapped some of the rumored sites in upstate New York, and the stories themselves have been written. They're fictional by the students from the course. So they try to put themselves in the shoes of freedom seekers heading north, and Their stories we put onto the site, both as a transcript as well as the recording. I'll just play the first 4 minutes of this for you.
You're listening to Voices on the Underground Railroad. The following story imagines the experience of a freedom seeker moving through the Finger Lakes region of New York State. It is inspired by an actual location on the Underground Railroad and the oral histories passed down over generations of those who found sanctuary there. Fear. What a word. Fear is a word that I can use to describe how I felt every single day for the first 18 years of my life that I spent on the Aaron plantation. Fear is a word that I can use to describe how I felt every time Master Aaron returned to the plantation in one of his moods. Fear is not a word I can use to describe how I felt at the thought of being separated from my sister, or to describe how I felt on the journey I am about to take you on. I have yet to find a word that can complete those tasks, and I don't believe I ever will. Throughout this story, I will use the real names of the people and places I encountered on my journey. Given that it has been 53 years since my journey, the people who helped me are long gone. There is no fear of retaliation. My name is Gloria Jones, daughter of Mary Jones. My mother had me and my little sister Hazel 2 years apart. My mother was with us until I was 10 years old, and then she was sold to a man named Willie Thomas. When it was time for my mother to depart, she hugged both me and my sister as we sobbed, begging her to stay. She held us so tight and whispered the last words I would ever hear from her. Stay together, children. Whatever it takes, stay together.
Okay, that's just to give you a sense of of what we've been doing over this past couple of years. And the reason we're doing it, and with the research that's coming up, I think the whole purpose is to be thinking of this whole question of social rebirth. And the reason that I do that as well is in my research, there was a law that was passed in Virginia, in the colony of Virginia in 1662. They used the Latin name for that law. It is called Partus Sequitur Ventrum. And basically what it means is that the child of the enslaved mother will carry her condition. Now that was passed in colonial Virginia, as I said, in 1662, but there were versions of that same law throughout the Americas, wherever there were plantations. And it's very important to recognize that these were things that were just going on in different areas and sort of became a kind of a best practice among slaveholders to think in those terms. And why would they do such a thing? First of all, I think for the plantation owner, when they were indentured servants, first of all, in the colonies in the earlier than the 1660s, the master of the indentured woman would be concerned if she were to give birth, then he would have to prolong her contract because that included childbearing and child raising. It wasn't the same with enslaved women. With enslaved women, didn't have to worry because the person was enslaved forever. Then you didn't have to worry about, losing time in terms of childbirth and child rearing. But then the child just became part of the inventory of the estate, of the plantation. And so it was at that time that this law was passed in 1662, and the result, of course, is one in which it affords certain masters, to perpetrate sexual violence on the enslaved women. That was one of the things that the byproducts that came out of this law. But what is also significant about this law is that at the time in the colonies, as well as in Europe, lineage was always along father's side. Patrilineage was what reigned socioeconomically, right? So in order to ensure that there was sufficient labor on the plantations, then people changed that from thinking about patrilineage to making sure that it was that slavery became an inheritable condition based on the mother's situation. Right, so that was something that was done in the Americas that was different from the practices in Europe. So the reason I go that far back is just to be thinking about this whole question of social rebirth. So that if that law was already determining that people would inherit slavery from their mothers, then in effect, what the Underground Railroad does is it repudiates that law. It provides the opportunity for people to go against that law. It's interesting to me that it becomes a space that allows people to go through, and then they assume a different condition, one which they still have to improvise and think about the justice of it wherever they settle, if they settle in the Free States, if they settle in Canada. But then that's a sort of a social rebirth. To what exactly is something that we're still trying to sort of figure out. And so this becomes a blueprint for other sorts of situations of refugees as well, in the contemporary world. So I think these are some of the ideas that have emerged in doing this kind of research. So Sushmita, I'll stop there and see if are there any questions you might have, something you'd like me to continue speaking about.
Thank you, Gerard. That was quite illuminating. We're about at the halfway mark. Is there any idea that you would really like to share in this circle before we go into an experiential piece? Is there anything you feel like you would want to drop into the space?
I would like us, me, that is, right? You're asking me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm asking you.
Yes, sorry. I would like us to think about that experience, that experience a bit of being somebody on the Underground Railroad. Very often it's, people think of it as something of flight, it's fear, but it also took enormous courage to do that. Mm-hmm. For lots of reasons we can probably discuss later on as well. So I think it's something for us to think about, imagining ourselves going mm-hmm. through an experience like that. Yeah.
Perfect segue, because that's exactly what we're going to do next. So what I would like to invite everybody at this point is to settle in for a short guided visualization. Before we start, let's just take a couple of breaths together so we feel both in our bodies and also part of this circle, this community. It's just as we breathe, we feel that we're all breathing, and the earth is breathing with us. That history is breathing with us. Our ancestors and the ancestors of the land that we sit on are breathing with us. And now I invite you to imagine yourself in the Underground Railroad, either as a freedom seeker or as a station agent. Maybe just take a moment to feel into which role feels more alive for you. There is no judgment. There is no better or worse. Do you feel a calling to imagine yourself as a freedom seeker, escaping a southern plantation, or a station agent in one of the northern states? Or maybe even somebody assisting the freedom seekers along the way. And now from that perspective, I invite you to imagine the moment, as far as you can, the moment when you made the decision to either become a freedom seeker, no longer a slave, or to become a facilitator for the freedom seekers, no longer just a spectator. The moment when that decision was made for you. And feel into all the things that are going on in you at that moment, or the moment right before it. Feel into both the fear and the hope. Feel into the despair and the possibility. Where did you hear for the first time that another future was possible? Who told you that? When? Imagine the people around you. Who can you trust? Who can you not trust? And what makes some people trustworthy and not others? What are you willing to forego? What are you willing to risk? Where are you willing to put your faith? In whose name do you do this work? Are you escaping for yourself? For the people you're leaving behind? For the generations yet to come? And if you are an ally for the freedom seekers, what is it that makes you risk your comfortable life? Feel into the complexities, the nuances. the anger, desire for revenge, and the desire to step forward, leaving that history as your past. And again, what clinches the deal for you? And as we come out of this reflection, bring with you into the room to share what from your experience of being on this Underground Railroad would you like to share with your brothers and sisters who are living in 2022? What is your message for them? And when you're ready, and slowly come back into the room. And since we have quite a few people in the room, maybe you can raise your virtual hands to share. And I see there's in the message, in the chat, there is something from Leslie. Leslie, would you like to speak into the room? Andrea.
Hi. I guess the thing that really spoke to me, like moved me to speak right now, is when you were asking about the moment, like that one moment. What was the moment that you made the decision to stand up or like break through the fear of whatever is holding you back from pursuing or protecting freedom? And for myself, like when you asked that, I couldn't settle on a moment when I decided to become an ally or a co-conspirator or whatever, like, because I feel like I make that decision all the time. Like it's a constant reminder, like it's a decision that I make every time I see something that is unfair or unjust, like, and I have to make it over and over and over again to remind myself to act from a place of my higher self, right? So I guess that is what I was supposed to say to everybody. But thank you, Sushmita. That was really nice.
Thank you, Andrea. And just for everyone to know, Andrea actually attends this church the AME Zion Church in Ithaca. She lives in Ithaca. Yeah, Dottie, go ahead.
The message that came into my head was, it's worth the risk. Stepping into the unknown is worth taking the risk.
Yes, thank you, Dottie. Yeah, unknown is the big word here. Lisa, go ahead.
Hi. My mother used to tell stories about the Shaker families. I don't know if that's historical, but they were involved in the Underground Railroad. And so I was just brought to that place of, hard lives, early settlers, scratching a living out of the land, giving birth silently, no complaining. And I can just imagine the fear of, but, maybe a friend in a quilting circle says, hey, but you know who you can't talk to. And your house is pretty far out, so people don't come around much. Maybe your husband pulls up a couple of boards to find a place to hide a child. And what occurred at the end when you said, what's the message? What popped into my head was Mother Teresa's, there are no great acts. There are only small acts done with great love. So I just think about all those housewives, only one person or come up with a little extra food, right? Just so earthy, but all together, it made this thing called the Underground Railroad. And what was the phrase that the professor used? Rebirthing.
Yeah, social rebirth. And thank you, Lisa. Yes, the small acts done with great love. Yes. Anna.
I found it really hard to put myself in one category or the other. And I wonder if part of that is my own family experience of being a descendant of both slave owners and slaves, people who killed indigenous people. And it made me think about the resistance that is involved with love in escaping, because you are basically stealing the only thing that your oppressor matters for your oppressor, which is your labor or the money that your offspring are going to give them. And that, along with people who were quite comfortable as station masters and people who were quite poor and marginal, have made a decision that a system in which other beings are treated the way that African enslaved people that have been brought over, or indigenous people, the way that they're treated, that system, that racialized capitalist system, is not permissible within their moral worldview. And that therefore, any small acts that undermine it is part of the long game towards changing that system, towards changing the number of people who care and are willing to take a risk. But clearly the first people that either run and help others run are taking that leadership risky role. And there's a rebirth there. And we see that in all the stories, how Sojourner Truth takes her name, and so changing one's name is such a big piece of it. And the other part that I love, especially with Lisa's intervention, is that the speaker has shown us the importance of learning spiritually in different modalities, and a pilgrimage, being able to physically touch a place is so powerful. And I found that very powerful, and the use of technology very powerful. It reminds me of a project that 60 Minutes showed, of the fact that so many Holocaust survivors are passing away. So they're using the technology to film and recreate individuals, people with stories, so that they can, the AI can actually, there's a hologram of them, they interact. And I think that it really gets to this idea of what is factual, what is great truth, and that great truth can come out of a creative exercise and an engagement with the physical. It's not just looking at archives. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Anna. That was quite something. And one of the words that you used, I love, is the long game, that they were engaged in the long game. And that's sometimes a problem with this kind of work, is we want results immediately. I went to a march yesterday, where is the result today? That's not how it works. Thank you for that. Leslie, I know you've been trying to raise your hand for a while, and now I see you, so go ahead.
Oh, great. Oh, victory. Thank you. Well, you know what? I had chatted a little story about my upbringing, so I am going to move on from that. And just for a moment, I want to bring back a personality that I studied when I was little, because my father brought me up in the Society of Friends, the Quakers. And you probably all know that the Quaker faith has long been a great ally of those who have been trodden upon. So I began to know and understand that at a very young age. One of the personalities, as a little girl, writing our little school reports and what have you, one of the personalities that I found when I was studying was this incredible woman, Harriet Tubman, who returned again and again and again to rescue her people. And from what I understand, she had, the name of this condition escapes me, but she had that sleeping sickness. You can fall asleep at any moment. And she just did this. So I want very much to offer her name and her courage to this community. That's all I have. And I'm sure there were others like her as well. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you. And actually in the video, the image that you saw at the end was Harriet Tubman. So thank you for naming her. Devin.
Hi. Thank you so much for this incredible presentation. I'm so grateful, and it's lovely to be here with all of you. And I love learning about this project. I can't wait to dive into that website. I am nervous, which I'm not always nervous when I'm sharing in these spaces, but I'm feeling a little bit nervous. But I'm feeling compelled to share what came up for me. And Anna or Anna, I'm not sure how you pronounce your name, but what you shared sort of gave me permission to share this. I got stuck, honestly, at choosing who I was. Because I was in a space, and I know that this has the capacity to open up a much larger conversation, which it doesn't need to, because I understand the container of this space and this gathering specifically. I felt I have never been in a position where I was doing a guided meditation or a visualization, visualizing myself being a person of color, which is a really interesting thing to realize. And I wanted to be able to do that. And at the same time, I didn't feel like it was my right to do that. And I also then was like, well, but I don't really feel like I should be like a white station master who's like the savior of this situation, because that doesn't feel right either. Like, that's not okay. Like, so I was like ping-ponging back and forth, like, how do I find a place that feels comfortable for me to visualize myself in? And then I ended up sort of going through it not as one person, but trying to imagine anyone in those situations, how they would be responding to or feeling about the questions that you asked. And so I just felt compelled to share that, because I'm not sure if anybody else was experiencing that. I'm sort of embarrassed about it, but I also just wanted to presence it because I think it's an important part of the conversation. And I also really honor how profoundly powerful the invitation to truly visualize and empathize in these situations as much as we can, but also presence that we might not feel like it's our right in some situations. So I don't know, I just wanted to share. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for naming that, Devin, because Gerard and I actually spoke about that before we started, and we were like, maybe we should give people the choice of either or, because there's always this conversation of, do I have the right? Is it appropriation? And I wanted to kind of get away from the intellectual moral piece and into the feeling piece. And Gerard, would you like to say anything to this?
It's definitely right now on the website. So far, I've been asking students to think about the experience of being on the Underground Railroad. But I'm also broadening it to just what was considered here. That is to say, somebody assisting on the Underground Railroad. And I think, both the person on the Underground Railroad and the person assisting are at risk. And especially after 1850, which was the fugitive slave law that made it a federal crime to assist anyone going on the Underground Railroad. So that in fact, somebody who was caught, as a station master could be thrown into jail for 6 months, which would ruin a family, or be fined $1,000, which in today's currency would be about $25,000. And so those were the risks being taken. And, for many people, because it was a federal law, they didn't want to disobey. But then the Underground Railroad itself is an act of civil disobedience, right? And so people had to take it upon themselves to ask the question, who is right in this particular situation? And there are people who are saying, well, there's a law above, there's a higher law, right, to which you would want to respond. And those were the kinds of decisions people made individually that allowed them to contribute or not. And again, some contributions, and this is to pick up on what was said earlier as well, the small acts, in the Black congregations, the women would collect a penny a week, and that would be sufficient to help with food and clothing and things like that. So, or a farmer may have a hiding place in a barn and would, take it upon himself or herself to hide someone, so there's so many stories like that, so I very much appreciate, the contributions to this conversation.
Thank you, Gerard. Leslie, I see your hand is up again. Do you have anything to add?
Yes, I want to thank you so much, Professor, for this whole endeavor, because it's bringing to light for me as I'm sure many of my generation, I'm 67 now. When I was little, none of this was presented. This was not talked about. We didn't hear about it much in school at all. Maybe it was a few lines in our textbook. I had the incredible privilege of being raised a Quaker, and I was surrounded by this. And I was filled with courage. You know, I began to realize what courage really was. And as a little girl in the 50s and 60s, that was a big deal because of what we have to have and still do. Everybody needs courage for whatever their issue, but I'm just saying, thank you so much, because this is so real now, so real. If we could get this going wherever along all of the railroad lines, that would be wonderful. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you. Lee, your hand's up.
Thank you so much for this presentation. You know, my experience in your reflection is as an attorney and as an officer of the court, and I'm thinking, you know, in my heart, I want to so much be a part of promoting this Underground Railroad. But then I can see, you know, my duties as an attorney. And so my question really is, if you could tell me like whether there were attorneys involved in the Underground Railroad.
I'd be happy to do that. What happened with the Underground Railroad? Yeah, there were attorneys on both sides. And let me see if I can be brief about this. Part of the Underground Railroad, at the core of the Underground Railroad, is something called the Vigilance Committee. And so there would be a Vigilance Committee in New York City, a Vigilance Committee in Philadelphia. The ones in the cities were the ones where the branches of the Vigilance Committees that would be in charge of defending people who might have been kidnapped or might have been, you know, of enslaved people or free people who had been kidnapped or people who made it through the Underground Railroad and they were grabbed by bounty hunters. The fugitive slave law had also created these commissions. And so you had a commissioner who you would go before who would decide if you were, in fact, the person who was being sought, or after. They would usually have an ad where they would identify you. And either the bounty hunter would have that information, or even the slave owner himself would bring that information. And so the commissioner, these were decided, and they had the powers of the court system so that they would make that decision. What was crazy was the fact that if they allowed the bounty hunter to take the person back into slavery, they would be paid $10. If they did not and let the person go free, they were paid $5. And then also the most significant thing is that the person who was caught was not allowed to give testimony, right? So there was no testimony. You could not speak for yourself, right? So that is why you had on both sides, you know, these commissioners that were provided for by the federal government in the fugitive slave law, right, enacting on those things. But then you also had lawyers who were working with the abolitionists, you know, to make sure that people had the chance to be defended in a court of law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's the answer there in brief.
Well, I hope that I would be on that side of defending.
And that you'll be satisfied with $5 instead of 10. Sharon, you might have the last word, or maybe not.
Thank you for this presentation. It indeed does take the courage of, no matter whether you're a station master or station chief, I don't know what you call that, or the enslaved person seeking freedom, it takes courage. What as I was going through the experience with Sushmita, I recognized that the fear is something that I still hold. The fear of my ancestors choosing to take a risk of going underground. I don't know if part of it is a memory, if it's cellular memory, but I'm pretty sure I know that fear, the intensity of that fear. Leslie, you and I are of the same generation. So I've had experiences from the 50s and 60s, and I grew up in the South. For me, I've always said since I was a little girl that fear that's associated with the reason for running has a smell to it. And for me, when I remember that fear, it's a metallic smell. Smells like iron to me. So there are times when I have that fear today. So I guess I'm talking about this because I kept coming back to, but that's the way I feel sometimes now, with certain experiences. Like, but I'm still on the railroad. I still need allies. I still need someone to stand up and speak when they observe injustice. So I believe that the imagery may be a little bit different, but the need for actions on both parties' parts and the intention still lives. It still lives. So I've been on 3 Zooms. This is the last Zoom of the night. And each one has had something to do. They've each been related, I'll say that. So thank you for those who choose to, because a lot of people can lose their job today if they have the wrong outlook or the wrong ideology and voice it and act upon it. You can lose your job. I mean, that's big stuff. So I thank myself for having the courage to speak up. And I thank anyone else who chooses to stand up for someone else. Because when you stand up for someone else, we really are standing up for ourselves too.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. And Diane.
Thank you, Sushmita, and thank you so much, Professor Aching. I keep hearing the Sweet Honey in the Rock song, Would You Harbor Me, going through my mind. And, there's such an extraordinary group of women, and that song is such a challenge to all of us. And they go through, one group after another, after another, after another, that is oppressed, the subject of attacks, and over again, they ask, would you harbor me? If you were in that position, would you harbor me? And I found myself during the visualization also thinking about the people in Germany who risked their lives to house Jewish children, Jewish families. There was a not as organized, but
certainly there were people who were allies, like the allies on the Underground Railroad. And I found myself thinking about the two gentlemen on the train in the Pacific Northwest who stood up to someone who was attacking one or two Muslim girls or women on the train, and literally gave their lives for that. That this continues to be so relevant today. So relevant. And, I wish I could say for sure that I would stand up. And humility says, I can't be sure. I hope so, but I can't be sure. So, thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And Reverend Terence, you have the last word.
Certainly, it's good to be provided this opportunity for this sharing of minds. As we even reflect on the magnitude that is the Underground Railroad and its history, my charge as an educator by trade and as the pastor of a church that was a stop on the Underground Railroad is that we as a people, both collectively and individually, if we claim to be woke, we have to also do the work so that we are now seeing in modern day times. I think there was someone mentioned, I think it was Leslie, who said that, slavery was mentioned a couple sentences in her textbook. Now that is still being threatened in 2022. So with the work of Professor Aching in Cornell and the collaborations with institutions such as St. James, we have to understand the power of our voice and maintaining that history, as well as the power of our presence and reminding others of the history, but most importantly, the power of the work. So that when we log off of our Zoom, we don't just speak in vain, but our actions follow what we say. And that's all that I had to say. Great, thank you for allowing me to share with you.
Thank you very, very much. And Gerard, do you have any last thoughts before we close?
My thoughts are ones of gratitude for your sharing. Those of you who spoke and those of you who haven't. I know, I've gotten so accustomed to seeing wheels turning when people visit sites or listen to things. So I want to thank all of you for being here and for thinking about what we've just been through, what Sushmita has just taken us through very nicely. So I appreciate, and I really did want to listen to you, and it was a privilege. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. This is the end of this gathering.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's a gonna trouble the water. See that